Minus 30 degrees. 40-foot giants of solid white water slammed into the deck of the Crabber Polaris like concrete walls. Captain Mick gripped the helm, his knuckles white eyes glued to the sonar screen. 12 massive, unknown blips had just materialized out of the abyss. They were clawing their way up from the deep at impossible speeds, completely ignoring the brutal Bering Strait currents that could rip a nuclear sub to pieces. Then came the screech of tearing metal. A massive, obsidian amphibious combat mech erupted from the surf. Plasma blades snapped out from its forelimbs, instantly shearing through the portside antifreeze steel railing. An alien broadcast boomed through the howling gale. Disarm and submit to assimilation, or the deep ocean will be your grave. Mick spat a glob of chewing tobacco onto the floor and slammed the broadcast mic open. The deep asshole. I've been stealing crabs from the Grim Reaper in this frozen pisswater for 20 years. Who the hell do you think you are? He didn't reach for a weapon release button. The ship didn't have any. Instead, he yanked the red lever, controlling the deck's main hydraulic crane. High above, an 800-pound solid steel crab pot, bristling with razor-sharp icicles, came hurtling down with the wrath of God, smashing right through the alien mech's prized composite shields. The entire keel of the Polaris groaned under the sudden agonizing strain, the thunderous crunch of steel on steel easily drowning out the roar of the 40-foot waves. A flying shard of metal sliced a bloody gash across Mick's weathered cheek. He didn't even bother to wipe it. His calloused hands stayed locked onto the hydraulic lever, his eyes boring into the carnage on the deck. 800 pounds of solid steel and jagged ice had driven the mech straight into the frozen deck plating. The composite shield hadn't held for half a second. The alien machine's chest armor collapsed like a cheap tin can, its internal servo skeleton snapping into 3 distinct pieces. Light blue liquid cooling lines ruptured, spraying coolant that froze into translucent icicles the exact moment it hit the minus 30-degree wind. The thing didn't even have time to pull the trigger on its plasma rifle before most of its power lights went dead. The extended plasma blade slipped from a severed mechanical arm, clattering onto the ice with a dull thud. The blinding plasma flame was instantly choked of all heat by the extreme cold, dying with a pathetic hiss and leaving nothing but a cold, rigid black blade wedged into a crack in the ice. 200 meters below the surface, inside the command deck of the assault dropship, red alarms shrieked, tearing through Val's auditory nerves. On the holographic tactical display, the green blip, representing his #1 amphibious combat mech, went stone dead just 0.7 seconds after making contact with the civilian fishing vessel's port side. Val's deep red compound eyes narrowed to pinpricks. As an elite strike commander of the abyssal vanguard, he had conquered 3 water-rich terrestrial planets. He had never given this blue planet's Arctic fringes a second thought. Minus 30 degrees? That was a routine low-temperature environment on any galactic battlefield. His composite shields could deflect a 100-kiloton nuclear warhead. How could it possibly fall to primitives? Then he pulled up the final frames transmitted by Mech 1. A massive 800-pound cage of solid dead iron was plunging straight toward the cockpit under the raw power of gravity. No energy signature. No hypersonic shockwave. Just a primitive lump of heavy metal. The composite shield's automated frequency modulation had completely ignored the low-velocity, high-mass kinetic impact. The next second, the feed cut to static. An insult. A blatant, unforgivable insult to the abyssal vanguard. Val's clawed, blue hand slammed onto the console, spiderwebbing the reinforced glass. He roared into the squad-wide comms channel, his voice dripping with barely contained fury. All remaining 11 units, terminate stealth protocols. Surface at maximum velocity and breach the Polaris immediately. Burn every living thing on that vessel to ash. On the command deck's holographic sonar, 11 bright green dots surged, tripling their speed. They streaked through the black water like a pack of wolves, heading straight for the bottom of the Polaris. The lead two mechs extended their mechanical grappling hooks, clamping them securely onto the trawler's submerged keel plates. Cold metal joints whined as they prepared to scale the ice-crusted hull and swarm the deck. Mick spat his bitter, spent tobacco plug onto the frozen cockpit floor, his rough palms squeezing the radio handset until his knuckles turned white. A 40-foot wave slammed the hull, tilting the Polaris so hard that cans of black coffee went rolling off the shelves. Out the windows, through the driving snow, two metallic heads glowing with faint blue energy emerged from the trough of a wave. Ice-crusted grappling hooks bit into the steel hull plating, their grinding screech piercing through the howling wind. On the port side, crewmen crouched behind what was left of the frozen railing, screaming curses. Mick bellowed over the radio, his voice louder than the blizzard. "First mate, fire up the high-pressure de-icing lines. Drown those sons of bitches. Copy that. High-pressure pumps at maximum." A gravelly voice exploded back. A second later, two streams of freezing water, thick as tree trunks, erupted from the deck nozzles. The Bering Sea water, packed with fine slush and ice crystals, slammed headfirst into the two climbing combat mechs. The deluge hit their composite shields, exploding into a massive cloud of airborne mist that swirled up the hull with the wind, instantly freezing into a semi-translucent sheet of ice across the cockpit windows. Mick grabbed a rag, wiped a clear spot on the glass, and squinted through the storm. The energy signatures of the remaining 9 mechs were lighting up one after another in the dark, churning waves. The tallest, heaviest of them all, the alien commander's mech, had already crested the violent swells. Ice slush clung to its cold, rigid alloy skin as its metallic fingers clamped down on the thick ice covering the deck railing. Half its glowing, etched torso broke the surface, preparing to haul its entire mass onto the frozen deck. The moment Val's amphibious combat mech cleared the crest of the Bering Sea waves, a piercing, unnatural chill seeped through the hull's sealed seams. The rotation speed of his wrist servo motors plummeted 20%, and the cockpit temperature alarm began to wail. The blizzard, heavy with ice crystals, swept across the frozen deck, forcing more sub-zero air into the joints of Val's machine. He glanced at the tactical display to check the status of his 2 lead units. Their readouts were cascading downward like an avalanche. Val looked up, and every sensory nerve in his body went rigid. The liquid seawater spraying onto his mech's outer chassis was freezing into solid, bright white ice within fractions of a second. The ice shell crawled up the ankles, seized the knees, and completely locked down every articulating joint, forcing hard ice crystals directly into the gears of the precision servo motors. One of the lead mechs tried to force its way up. Its drive shaft gave 2 violent metallic cracks before the gears jammed solid with ice. Its entire upper torso froze rigid on the ship's railing, arms still locked in a climbing position. Within 30 seconds, its fusion battery output plunged 70%, converting the elite machine into a glorified lump of ice-covered iron welded to the side of the ship. Val slammed his console in frustration. The pre-deployment galactic intel had classified Earth as a low-tech, primitive backwater. It hadn't said a damn word about this psycho weather. He tried to raise his plasma rifle, but his shoulder joint had already accumulated a layer of frost, dragging his response time down by a full second. The cockpit warning lights were now a blinding, flashing red as the core operating system threw critical low-temperature fault codes. Behind the reinforced glass of the upper bridge, the bearded, tobacco-stained human finally made his move. His calloused hand reached for the black radio mic mounted next to the helm. His thumb slammed the broadcast button, and a blast of static and howling wind erupted across the radio frequency of the entire Dutch harbor crabbing fleet. Mick's gravelly voice tore through the storm, carrying the distinct, unapologetic swagger of an Alaskan redneck. Listen up, you Dutch harbor bastards. We got a school of oversized alien king crabs drifting right into the Bering Sea. Warm up your winches and bring your heavy gear. It's time to divide up the quota. He spat out the remaining shreds of his tobacco. The gunk hit the frost-rimmed glass and stuck there. Mick looked back out at the deck. The two mechs hit by the high-pressure lines had already hardened into inanimate ice sculptures, their glowing composite shields completely dark. In the middle of the boarding ladder, Val's mech was twitching awkwardly, its joints encrusted with half an inch of solid ice. Every centimeter it tried to move produced a horrific, crunching screech of metal grinding against frozen water. The status light for its fusion battery flickered erratically, looking like a dying clam suffocating in the shallows. Beside him, Tom, the first mate, gripped the high-pressure water valve control like grim death. The icicles hanging from his beard rattled against the console as he growled, "The bastards are making a move, Captain." Every single degree of rotation in the combat mech's shoulder joints produced a deafening metallic pop as ice crystals were crushed inside the casing. Val pressed himself against his cockpit's viewing screen. He unleashed a furious, ice-choked roar into the public comms frequency while his hand slammed down on the fire command button. The remaining 8 functional combat mechs had managed to haul themselves onto the port deck. Counting himself, that made 9 active combat units. Every plasma rifle swung in unison, aiming directly at the upper bridge of the Polaris. Deep blue plasma streams converged at the muzzles, forming blinding spheres of superheated energy. Val waited for the thin glass cockpit doors to melt into slag. He waited to watch these miserable human fishermen scream as they turned to ash. These primitive, carbon-based anomalies dared to freeze his soldiers. They dared to broadcast a distress call across the ocean. 9 plasma bolts erupted from the muzzles simultaneously. The next second, Val's pupils shrank to microscopic pins. The -30-degree blizzard acted like a greedy, insatiable maw, instantly leaching away over 90% of the plasma's thermal energy. The beams, which should have burned through a meter of solid reinforced armor plating, diffused into blurry, faint blue halos after traveling barely 3 meters. They washed harmlessly against the bridge's reinforced glass, leaving nothing but a shallow, finger-wide scorch mark. Not a single crack formed. Val's fusion battery output plummeted another 7%. The servo motor in his mech's right leg let out a high-pitched, agonizing whine, right on the verge of seizing completely. He cursed violently, hammering his controls, his fingers shaking too badly to input a second fire command. The status screens were a sea of red and yellow low-temperature warnings. Then, his eyes locked onto the heavy steel cabin door. He heard it clearly over the storm, the heavy, muffled clank of a deadbolt being thrown. The heavy steel door swung open with a loud groan. The blizzard rushed inside, throwing ice crystals straight into Mick's face and making the old scar on his cheek throb with pain. He didn't care. He grabbed a 2-inch thick industrial steel pipe leaning against the bulkhead. The crew charged out behind him, their boots stomping onto a deck slick with half an inch of solid ice. On the port side, the first 2 combat mechs stood frozen in place, encased in a brilliant sheen of ice. Their joints were completely sealed, leaving only the low-power emergency lights on their flanks, blinking a miserable dying red. First Mate Tom took the lead, letting out a wild howl as he used the ship's roll to slide forward. He lined up the jagged tip of his steel pipe and drove it deep into the open cooling vents on the mech's flank. The crunch of snapping circuits and fracturing components echoed from inside the chassis. The machine's lights went completely black. 2 crewmen followed right behind him, revving preheated chainsaws and taking up positions outside the cockpit hatch to make sure whatever was inside stayed inside. Mick walked up to the second frozen mech, muttered a quiet "dumbasses," and swung his steel pipe with everything he had, ramming it straight into the chest exhaust port. The pipe buried itself up to his grip. The already failing servo motor suffered an immediate short, cutting the main power. The mech gave a low, hollow hum as sheets of surface ice cascaded down its armor, slumping lifelessly against the railing. Mick yanked the pipe free. Blue-green alien fluid mixed with slush trickled down the metal, freezing into hard spots the moment it hit the deck. He spat his bitter tobacco residue, his eyes shifting to the center of the deck where the 9 remaining abyssal vanguard mechs stood. His hand tightened around the freezing steel pipe. On Val's tactical display, the red dots representing his 2 disabled vanguard units abruptly vanished. A spike of feedback static bit into his neural receptors, sending a sharp throb of pain through his compound eyes. The sub-zero blizzard had thoroughly penetrated the gaps in the armor plating. The cockpit's life support systems were wheezing, struggling to stay online while the alarms barked like rabid dogs. The right leg servo temperature had dropped below the critical red line. It could seize at any moment. The fusion battery output had cratered. The system was repeatedly flashing retreat prompts, which he bypassed with brutal, frantic keystrokes. He was an elite strike commander of the Abyssal Vanguard. He had conquered 17 habitable worlds with vast oceans. How could he die at the hands of primitive crab fishermen? His soldiers had just been neutralized by a couple of primitive metal rods rammed into their cooling vents. Val's eyes turned white with rage. He slammed the overload ignition switch, forcing the system back to nominal power output while completely ignoring the skyrocketing temperature warnings from the battery core. All units, engage close quarters combat. Tear that captain to pieces. The 8 operational mechs forced their joints to rotate, shedding sheets of ice that clattered loudly against the deck. The faint blue glow of their composite shields flickered weakly in the gale, their plasma blades and rifles losing half their brilliance the moment they exposed them to the wind. Val gripped his sticks, his right leg letting out a horrific crunch as it tore through the frozen gears. The heavy metallic foot crushed the thick ice on the deck, charging straight toward the gruff human standing by the cabin door with the steel pipe. The wind whipped sea spray across his observation window. Val could practically smell the stench of seawater and chewing tobacco on the human. But then a deep, bass-heavy rumble vibrated through the hull from below, a sound like the entire ocean floor flipping over. A wall of water, dozens of meters high, crested right over the railing of the Polaris. The ship listed violently to the starboard side at a 27-degree angle. Loose deck ice and seawater instantly turned into a flying wall of frozen shrapnel in the -30-degree wind. Mick didn't hesitate. He used the momentum to throw himself sideways, locking his arms around a heavy mooring bit in the center of the deck. 20 years of muscle memory in the Bering Sea was more reliable than any automated stabilizer. Tom and the younger crewmen did the exact same, either wedging themselves into non-slip deck grooves or hugging the anchor chains. Nobody screamed. They just grit their teeth and took the impact. Val and his 8 mechs didn't have that kind of muscle memory. The entire deck was a sheet of smooth, half-inch thick ice. Their anti-slip traction algorithms were designed for the standard rocky beaches of the galaxy. On pure ice, they might as well have been walking on hot butter. The moment the wave's kinetic force hit, every single mech lost its footing. The lead unit slid backward along the tilted deck, its lower chassis clipping the remaining steel railing. It went completely airborne, landing flat on its back with a massive crash. Its plasma rifle skittered away across the ice, throwing off a trail of blue sparks. The rest went down like dominoes, the deafening clank of metal hitting metal vibrating right through Mick's boots. Val's right leg servo was already on the verge of failing. When he went down, freezing seawater forced its way directly into the joint housing, instantly locking the limb in place. His mech skidded 2 meters across the slick ice, its spine slamming violently into the base of the main hydraulic crane, shaking the cockpit screen until small shards of glass began to flake off. Val fought through a wave of explosive vertigo, gritting his teeth as he channeled what little fusion power he had left, shoving the control sticks to their absolute limits. The combat mech's right leg didn't budge an inch. The overloaded servo motor could only emit a sharp, high-pitched whine that vibrated through the frozen armor plating and directly into Val's spine. The sub-zero blizzard whistled through the fractures in his cockpit glass, freezing his optical receptors until they began to curl. The seawater that had flooded his right leg joint had frozen solid, completely locking the mechanical transmission. His fusion battery indicator was deep in the red, draining 3 times faster than his system could calculate. He gritted his teeth, forcing his left leg to plant against the slick ice, barely managing to lift his upper chassis off the deck. But then, his comms channel exploded into a chaotic mess of screaming panic. The remaining 8 units couldn't get up. They were all screaming the same thing: joints frozen solid, shield output at 0, batteries experiencing catastrophic voltage drops. They were trapped in the exact same nightmare. Suddenly, an emergency override broadcast from the assault dropship cut through the static, the piercing tone making Val's temples throb. He forced his tactical display to external wide view, squinting through the driving snow toward the horizon. At first, there was only the dark, blurry reflection of the swells. A second later, dozens of blinding, high-intensity spotlights pierced through the blizzard. The automated tinting on his visor instantly dropped to its darkest setting, forcing Val to squint against the glare. The low, thundering roar of steel hulls cutting through 40-foot waves vibrated through his armor from 3 nautical miles away. The tactical display refreshed, lighting up with red dots. 30 of them. A massive, interlocking grid that completely cut off every possible dive and evasion route for his assault dropship. The spotlights of every single vessel were pinned squarely on the dropship's hull. Massive nets hanging from crane booms had already been released from their locks. Their heavy, ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, UHMWPE, steel cables snapping taut in the wind with a high-pitched, deafening scream. Inside the bridges of those 30 crabbers, the air was thick with diesel fumes and tobacco smoke. The screech of those strained cables echoed through the hulls and into every captain's controls. Every single radio channel exploded with the same gruff command: "Drop the nets!" The Sea Witch, positioned right at the front, was the first to act. Captain Tucker slammed his hydraulic lever forward. A 40-ton boom swung out, carrying a massive trawl net packed with heavy lead weights. The sub-zero wind made the netting snap like gunfire, the specialized blue steel fiber glistening under the glare of the spotlights. 30 ships moved in perfect synchronization. Over 100 booms swung out simultaneously, spreading a massive net matrix across half the horizon. It came down like a wooden bowl over a trapped crab, enveloping the abyssal Vanguard dropship before its submersibles could even begin their diving sequence. The heavy lead weights slammed against the dropship's smooth alloy hull. The netting instantly tightened, wrapping itself securely around the vessel's rear propulsion screws. The massive propellers managed barely half a rotation before jamming solid, causing the massive alien ship to flounder helplessly in the 40-foot waves. Across the fleet, hydraulic winches began to roar, their gears grinding so hard they threw off heat. On the monitoring screens, the outline of the trapped dropship was completely clear. A chorus of redneck captains burst into a riotous laugh over the radio. "This alien bastard is fatter than that blue whale we caught last year. This quota's gonna feed us for 3 damn years." Back on the ice-slick deck of the Polaris, Mick's boots crunched over the thick ice as he walked toward the stern. His hand wrapped around the heavy lever of the industrial wood chipper, his eyes locked onto the flipped combat mech. After the massive wave tilted the ship, the machine had begun sliding down the ice, moving directly toward the mouth of the chipper. Tom hung onto a steel column, screaming over the wind, "Captain! Its mechanical arm is jammed right in the gear teeth. Don't let the bastard move." Mick chewed on the bitter tobacco, spitting a brown glob that drilled a tiny hole into the deck ice and threw the lever all the way down. The deep, metallic growl of the industrial blades instantly drowned out the storm. The hardened steel gears bit into the high-strength alloy arm of the alien mech. Metal shavings and hydraulic fluid sprayed from the housing, hitting the sub-zero air and freezing into silver-gray slush within half a second. The mech thrashed, trying to wrench its body free, but as the mechanical arm was violently sheared and crushed, the chassis gave a massive shudder. The remaining energy sheen on its armor vanished, leaving nothing but a faint, dying red light inside the cockpit. Mick wiped the frozen sea spray from his face, grabbed the radio mic hanging around his neck, and spat blind pieces of tin foil. "You think you can block my crabbing lane and get away with it?" He looked up at Val, who was pinned in the middle of the deck, completely immobile. He watched as the alien commander's helmet snapped toward the sea. 30 spotlights from the Dutch harbor fleet were pinned directly onto the trapped dropship. Its propulsion screws were completely choked by the heavy polyethylene nets, leaving the massive vessel to pitch uselessly in the swells. The frantic distress signals bleeding through the airwaves scraped violently against Val's nerves. The crimson warning lights next to Val's fractured console were flashing erratically. On his tactical display, the life support signature of the mech that had just slid into the industrial chipper spiked once, then went flat. The sub-zero blizzard poured through the cracks in his cockpit, numbing his appendages. His right leg joint was completely fused. The fusion battery readout was so deep in the red it looked ready to burn through the display, draining 3 times faster than anything he had ever seen in a live combat zone. He leaned heavily on his controls, his gaze piercing the storm. 30 blinding spotlights illuminated his dropship, pinned under the massive trawl nets. The ship's propulsion was dead, its diving modules compromised. The distress calls flooding the comms channel were desperate, frantic, and completely tearing his sanity apart. He had arrogantly assumed this shallow Earth sea would be just as easy to conquer as any other water world in the galaxy. His composite shields could deflect lasers. His mechs could run silent. How could they lose to primitive fishermen? But the extreme cold had paralyzed their servos. Their plasma had dissipated into useless waste heat. And these crude savages who hunted sea creatures for a living had just dragged the elite abyssal vanguard straight into hell. Val ground his mandibles together, screaming into the comms. "All remaining units, abandon the vessel. Return to the water and defend the dropship." Static-choked, panicked responses filtered back. 7 mechs with stiffened joints began to clumsily slide and stumble across the ice, tumbling over the railing of the Polaris and into the churning black waves. The final unit, Val's own command mech, suffered a sudden loss of balance, tipping backward and plunging toward the freezing surface of the Bering Sea. Inside the bridges of the 30 Dutch harbor crabbers, the air was thick with the scent of wintergreens and tobacco. Every captain was pressed against their frozen windshields, watching the 8 mechs clumsily throw themselves into the water. The Marine Band radio erupted into absolute hysterics. "Haul 'em in. Let's harvest these shiny king crabs." Captain Tucker's voice boomed across the wireless, and 30 heavy hydraulic winches fired up simultaneously. The cast-iron drums let out a low, thundering roar as the heavy polyethylene lines went taut. As the sub-zero wind whipped across them, the cables instantly grew a layer of razor-sharp ice needles, groaning under the incredible tension. Thousands of tons of pure mechanical pull exerted force from every direction. The massive trawl nets snapped shut like a noose, the mesh tightening until the openings were no bigger than a fist, locking down tightly around the dropship's dead propellers. The 7 mechs that had just hit the water tried to swim toward the net, but before they could even draw their plasma blades to cut the mesh, the constricting walls of the net slammed them hard against the dropship's hull. Their already failing servos locked up entirely under the pressure. They couldn't even move a mechanical finger. Val's mech had barely broken the surface when the perimeter cable of the net caught its remaining functional left leg, violently dragging it back out of the water. Ice, slush, and seawater poured from the net, freezing into solid ice chunks the second they hit the air. The massive web, holding both the dropship and the 8 combat units, was slowly hoisted out of the ocean by the winches dangling dozens of meters in the air. The freezing wind whipped through the mesh, and within minutes, a 1-inch thick layer of ice coated the mech's hulls. Every single fusion battery indicator flipped to a blinding critical red. The faint light emanating from the machines slowly died out. Dangling at the very apex of the net, Val's mech hung askew, its frozen upper torso facing directly down toward the ice-covered deck of the Polaris. A stocky, heavily jacketed figure was stepping down the cockpit ladder, one rung at a time. Rubber soles crunched against the frozen steps, sending shards of ice cascading downward. Mick held a heavy industrial drill by the handle, a solid lump of chewing tobacco bulging in his jaw. Every step he took left a deep, heavy thud on the frozen deck. He walked directly beneath the dangling combat mech and looked up. The machine was encased in an inch of pure ice, its torso twisted awkwardly, the heavy polyethylene cable buried deep inside its left leg joint. The blinding red light of its failing fusion battery bled through the cracks, casting a shifting, ominous crimson glow across the deck. The crew of the Polaris leaned against the bulwarks with their arms crossed, watching the show. The wind made the heavy canvas tarps snap violently, and one of the crewmen let out a long, low whistle. Mick spat a stream of dark tobacco juice. It rolled across the ice for 2 meters before catching in the base of a hydraulic pump. He plugged the drill into an industrial outlet on the side of the deckhouse, dragging the thick black power cord across the ice. The moment he squeezed the trigger, the drill let out a powerful whine that vibrated right into his arms, the alloy bit spinning into a cold metallic blur. A piece of junk iron blocking my crabbing lane. "Don't care what planet you're from, you're getting gutted," he grunted, leaning his entire 200-pound frame into the tool, planting the bit firmly against the armor seam of Val's cockpit, the exact point where the primary power lines ran. The bit chewed through the surface ice before biting into the dense alien alloy. A shower of blue-white sparks and ice shards sprayed directly into Mick's face. He didn't even blink. He threw his full weight behind the drill, forcing it deeper. The entire dangling mech began to sway back and forth under the pressure, the trawl cables groaning in protest as large chunks of ice shattered and fell to the deck. In less than 10 minutes, the drill gave a sudden lurch, punching straight through the armor plating. Mick killed the power, tossed the drill onto the ice, and shoved his large, calloused, crab-scarred hand right into the hole. His fingers wrapped around the thumb-thick primary power cable. His knuckles turned white. With a violent twist of his wrist, his steel-reinforced forearm yanked backward. The red main cable snapped with a sharp pop. Every single status light inside the mech went dead instantly. The -30-degree cold outside the cockpit rushed into the breach, flooding the sealed command pod. Frost rushed across Val's visor in a fraction of a second. The tips of his digits lost all sensation on the controls. The mech's remaining servo systems died completely, leaving the machine as cold and rigid as a block of ice, swinging uselessly from the crane of the Polaris. He frantically scraped at the frost on his visor, squinting through the frozen glass. The wind howled, driving snow across his chassis. Outside, the bearded, tobacco-chewing Dutch harbor fishermen were stepping onto the frozen deck, crowding around the other 7 captured mechs. They were swinging heavy pry bars and industrial wrenches, treating the elite machines like a fresh catch of king crabs. The horrific screech of tearing metal echoed over the roar of the wind. A young crewman pried open a battery housing and let out a wild scream. "Found it!" A group of men grabbed the core of the fusion battery, yanked it free with a massive heave, and threw it into a heavy iron storage bin with a loud clank. 6 batteries were already sitting in the bin. The crude, boisterous laughter of the fisherman echoed through his frozen hull. The elite commander of the abyssal vanguard watched the rough-faced captain who had drilled into his chest plate. He watched the man brush the ice from his gloves and turn back toward the cockpit, his heavy rubber boots crunching louder and louder against the frozen deck. Rubber boots stomped up the frost-rimmed steps, the crunching sound easily piercing the howl of the storm. The diesel heaters on the Polaris were completely overwhelmed by the extreme cold. The cabin windows were covered in half an inch of thick frost, and the breath of the crew turned into fine ice crystals the second it left their mouths. Mick yanked the stove door open, completely ignoring the blistering heat that made his gloves smoke, and shoved the alien fusion battery right into the firebox. He slammed the iron door shut with a heavy clank. In less than 10 seconds, a wave of intense radiating heat erupted from the stove. The sudden blast of hot air sent the icicles hanging from the ceiling crashing to the floor, and the cabin temperature skyrocketed. Mick ripped off his frozen gloves, rubbing his cracked knuckles, and let out a massive laugh, exhaling a cloud of white mist that smelled heavily of wintergreens. This alien heating pad is pretty damn slick. 2 young deckhands scrambled over to warm their hands, while Tom leaned against the helm, exhaling a ring of smoke. "You lost your mind? Shoving a nuclear core into a wood stove? You trying to blow us all up and feed us to the crabs?" Mick wiped at the old scar on his cheek, where a fresh bead of blood had frozen into a tiny red pearl. He picked up a massive, half-foot-long crescent wrench resting by the door and turned back toward the deck. The wind threw a handful of snow directly into his face. Mick walked back out, his boots finding a steady rhythm until he stood right in front of Val's frozen combat mech. Through the translucent sealed cockpit canopy, he could see the blue-skinned alien commander frozen stiff in his pilot's seat. Mick tapped the heavy wrench against the ice-covered glass, spat out the last of his tobacco juice, and raised the tool. Val's consciousness felt like a frozen current, suspended somewhere between life and death. The bitter chill had cut right through his thermal gel and failed life support, making every nerve in his body throb with agony. He could barely manage to roll his eyes, his gaze locked onto the massive human silhouette standing just outside his frost-rimmed viewport. He had never imagined a defeat like this. As a strike commander of the abyssal vanguard, he had broken 3 planets that possessed actual standing militaries. His composite shields were supposed to deflect any energy weapon in the galaxy. His plasma blades could slice through 100 millimeters of reinforced armor steel. But the northern reaches of this blue planet didn't play by the rules of high-tech warfare. A -30-degree blizzard had frozen their high-precision servos. Seawater, from a simple high-pressure hose, had sealed their joints in a matter of seconds. Hydraulic winches with thousands of tons of raw pull had twisted their strongest alloy into scrap metal. And now, the crown jewel of their engineering, their fusion batteries, had been ripped out by primitive hunters and shoved into a crude space heater to serve as an alien warming pad. A dull thud vibrated through the ice. Then another. The human captain, his mouth stained with tobacco and his cheek bleeding, was methodically hammering the heavy crescent wrench against the reinforced glass, sending a shower of ice crystals down with every strike. The muffled vibration of his voice filtered through the armored plating, carrying the raw, biting air of the Bering Sea. "Stop hiding, kid. Come on out and take a look at your fleet." One final strike hit the glass. The ice fractured, and the reinforced viewport shattered into a web of cracks. The sub-zero blizzard rushed into the cockpit, freezing the last remaining spark of Val's consciousness. He finally understood. The brutal, unforgiving physics of this planet were far more merciless than any advanced weapon system in the galaxy. The very last image that registered in his fading sight was the blinding glare of 30 crab boats, their lights illuminating a massive, ice-crusted trawl net, and inside that net hung his invincible dropship, looking exactly like a massive king crab hauled out of the deep, freezing silently in the bitter wind of the Bering Sea.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming along on this wild frozen ride. When I first sat down to conceptualize this story, I wanted to completely subvert a classic sci-fi trope, the overwhelming high-tech alien invasion. We're so used to seeing these sleek, heavily armed invaders raining lasers down on global capitals, or engaging in epic battles with elite military forces. But I asked myself, what if they landed somewhere that absolutely refuses to play by the rules of advanced physics? What if they dropped right into the Bering Sea? For me, the beating heart of this story is raw, unpolished human grit. The humanity? Fuck yeah. HFY genre is incredibly fun to play with, and I wanted to use it to celebrate the kind of blue-collar workers who make their living in the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Captain Mick and his crew are ant superheroes. They don't have plasma shields or fusion reactors. They just have heavy steel cables, industrial hydraulic winches, and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by anyone or anything, even an elite alien vanguard blocking their crabbing lanes. Writing the contrast between Val's cold, aristocratic corporate arrogance and the pragmatic, unapologetically redneck ingenuity of the crab fishermen was an absolute blast. There is something deeply satisfying and darkly humorous about watching a multi-billion-dollar amphibious combat mech get instantly neutralized by a rusted, 800-pound steel crab pot, or seeing a highly advanced fusion core used as a makeshift space heater in a diesel stove. This story is a love letter to human resilience, a nod to the brutal and uncompromising power of Mother Nature, and of course, a heavy dose of icy, absurdist black comedy. I hope you enjoyed witnessing this clash between galactic ego and Alaskan stubbornness just as much as I enjoyed writing it.